Hey everybody, Miss Russell here yet again with another lecture. Today we are going to be discussing the elements and principles of design. Now, this is not something that is unique to photography, just like composition was not unique to photography. The elements and principles of design are something that you would discuss in any art class that you take. They learn about it next door in visual arts, and then on the other side in digital arts. There's the bell. You would learn about it in any art class that you take. I like to say that with every lecture, you are adding another tool to your photography toolkit. And today is one of the best tools. Today and tomorrow are some of the best tools that you can add to your photography toolkit. Learning about the elements and principles of design and then learning about how to use them are really going to take your photos to that next level. Okay? So today and tomorrow, we are going to talk about 11 of the elements and principles of design, okay? I'm going to identify what they are, show you some images that provide examples so that you can then apply these to your own photographs. So we're going to start with line. Now, line should be very familiar to you because we talked about it in composition. And the reason that we talk about it in both presentations is because in composition, remember, composition is how you arrange the elements in your photograph, right? Like where you put them. And with the elements and principles, we talk about line just as an element. We can identify, oh, there's line in a photograph. And with composition, it's where you place that line in your photograph. I hope that clarifies the difference a bit. So what is a line? A line is an identifiable path created by a point moving through space. We all know what a line is, right? A point moves through space and it leaves behind a line. It's usually one-dimensional, or it is one-dimensional, and it can vary in width, like how wide it is, in the direction that it goes, and how long it is, okay? Lines often define the edges of a form or a shape, right? So on the outside of a form or a shape, you can follow the line of that form or shape. And line, what does it do in a photograph? It leads our eye through a composition. We learned about that in it leads our eye through a photograph. We learned about that when we discussed composition. So there are several different types of line. Again, this should be familiar to you because we talked about these different types of line and composition. The first are horizontal lines. Again, they bring stability to a photograph, right? They create a sense of rest and stability. Vertical lines communicate that sense of power, of strength. Diagonal lines create a feeling of movement, and your eye follows from one corner of the composition up to the other. And because they are not stable, because they're not settled one way or the other, they create kind of this feeling of unrest, okay? And then lastly, a curved line, as we learned about in composition, creates energy because your eye just quickly whips through that photograph as it follows that curved line. So here are some examples of different types of lines. Remember, diagonal lines create feelings of movement. They usually draw our eye to a point of interest. Does this sound familiar? Leading lines are often diagonal lines, right? They create movement because they're unstable and they create movement, and our eyes follow those diagonal lines, typically to a point of interest. Again, these are just a few more examples. This should be kind of review for us. Vertical lines creating that feeling of power, horizontal lines creating more of a sense of rest and stability, and then curved lines, because our eyes follow that curved line all the way down and around and around and around, a little bit more energy, okay? The next element that we are going to talk about today, shape and form. And what is the difference between the two? We all know what shapes are, right? Shapes are something that we learned as 2-year-olds. They are triangles and circles, and you know all the shapes, right? They are two-dimensional. That's the difference between a shape and a form. A shape is the outline of a figure, okay? So it's flat, it's two-dimensional. We can't see any detail. We can't see any shadows. It's all just flat, two-dimensional outline of an object or of a figure, right? Form, on the other hand, has height, it has width, and it has depth. So it is three-dimensional, okay? So it has shadows, it has light, it has detail, all right? There are two different types of shape and form. We have geometric, which are those mathematical shapes that we talked about, triangle, circle, rectangles, ovals, okay? So those are geometric shapes because they are more mathematical in nature. And then we have organic shapes. They are typically irregular, they're asymmetrical, and they're often found in nature because they're not a mathematical shape. They're organic, they're more the things that you would find in nature, right? Like the shape of a tree would be an organic shape or an organic form. So if you're having a hard time understanding the difference between a shape and a form, I feel like these images really kind of bring it home what shape and form are. So if we look up at the top image, the two dancers who are kind of intertwined, they would be the example of form, right? Because they are three-dimensional. We see contrast, we see shadows, we see depth, right? We see details. Whereas the shadow that they cast in the background is a two-dimensional shape. All right, so the figures in the foreground, that represents form, and then the shadow cast in the background represents shape. The humans are three-dimensional, the shadow is two-dimensional, so form versus shape. And all these photographs kind of show the same thing. Over here, the flower on the right. The flower is a form because we see detail, it's three-dimensional, it has height, it has width, it has depth, we see shadows, we see light, we can see the details of that flower. However, the shadow that it casts in the background, we lose details, we lose depth. And so we just have an outline of the shape. So that is our shape. And then same thing with the chess piece. Form in the foreground, shape in the background. And then again, the difference between geometric shape versus organic form. So on the left-hand side, we have a geometric shape, right? Mathematical shapes. We see triangles, we see rectangles, we see circles. All of these are geometric shapes, and we know that they're shapes because they are just outlines, right? There's no form there. We don't see shadows, we don't see details, we don't see contrast. We see just shapes. So that's an example of a geometric shape on the left. And then on the right-hand side, this is more organic. You notice we have curved lines, it's irregular, something that we find in nature. It's asymmetrical, okay? So this is an organic. And this would be an organic form because why? Because we see details, because we see shadows, because it has both height and width and depth. Excuse me. Okay, moving on. The third element that we are going to talk about today is space. Okay? Space, what you need to know about space is that it is represented by positive versus negative space, okay? So we say that positive space is your subject, right? And then negative space is all of the empty area that surrounds your subject, okay? So if we look at our photo here, our subject, the silhouette of this woman, she is the positive space. She's filling up the space, okay? So she's the positive space in that image. The empty sky all around her, that's what we would call our negative space. Another component of space is depth, as we talked about just a little while ago. Depth, right? We have a foreground, we have a middle ground, we have a background. We know that when we look at a photo, we see the space in that photo. We can see that there's things in the front, things in the middle, things in the back. Okay, so that's a component of space as well. Moving on to our fourth element is color. And color is pretty straightforward. We all know what color is, but maybe you didn't know that the three main characteristics of color are hue, value, and intensity. So hue is a fancy way of saying the name of the color, right? So if I asked you, what is the hue of your shirt? Well, the hue of my shirt is blue, yellow, and green. All right, so hue, again, is a fancy way of saying the name of the color. Of course. I will take that to break to take a drink of water. Okay, hopefully you can hear me over the music, but I don't want to stop this because we're already 10 minutes in, and I would hate to have to start over. So value is how light or dark the color is, right? If you look at the image of the dripping colors down on the bottom, right? One of the hues is blue, but we see a couple of different values there. We see a light blue and we see a dark blue. So value, again, is how light or dark a color is. And then the third main characteristic of color is intensity. And that it tells us how bright or how dull a color is, right? Intensity is also known, if you ever edit photos on your on like an app on your phone. Intensity is also known as saturation. So the more saturated your color is, the more bright red it is versus like a dull red. That's the intensity or the saturation of your photograph. Colors can also be described as being warm or cool, okay? And these also can have effect on our photographs. Warm colors are usually in the red, orange, and yellow family, okay? So kind of the first part of the rainbow are our warm colors, or the first part of the color spectrum. Red, orange, and yellow. These colors often create a sense of energy, okay? Think about it. Bright colors, they can make you feel happy, they can make you feel angry, they can make you feel irritated. These are all intense emotions, right? So warm colors often create more intense emotions in a viewer. So you'll notice here the firefighters, right? Really bright, vibrant colors, and that gives us a really energetic image. Whereas cool colors, which are the opposite end of the rainbow or the opposite end of the color spectrum, are usually blues, purples, greens, and they often create the opposite, like not crazy emotions. They actually create feelings of calm and tranquility and peace. And I think you can kind of see that by looking at both of these images side by side, right? You have the firefighters, lots of energy going on. You have this like beautiful landscape, a lot more calming and peaceful. And so these color tones really have an impact on the mood of the viewer, okay? The next element that we are going to talk about today is texture, one of my favorites. I think texture images are so visually interesting. And what texture is that we can sense the surface quality of an object through an image. We can look at an image and know whatever is being photographed, we know what it would feel like, okay? So artists, whether you're a photographer or a painter, you can create feelings of texture. Even though if you were to feel a photograph, it's always going to be smooth, right? But in reality, it's smooth, but you know that if you were to like actually be able to stick your hand into that photograph and feel the subject, you could tell from the image what it would feel like, okay? Texture creates a lot of drama, and it's really dependent on light. You really want to have a lot of contrast, lots of shadows and highlights in your photograph in order to create the texture, because you'll notice in this photo, all of those cracks, you have shadows sitting down in those cracks, and then the light hits the surface. And so that's why you really have that high contrast between the light sand and the really dark cracks. So texture is very much dependent on light. A few more examples of texture. You'll notice in all of these photos that the texture is really filling the entire photograph. So when you go to do your project and you're taking photos of texture, make sure that it is entirely filling the frame, right? Get really close up to the subject and allow the texture of that subject to fill the frame. So you'll notice in our first photograph, older gentleman, his face filled with wrinkles, really textured hair, right? Obviously this sounds a little weird, but if you would know what that feels like if you were to touch it. Okay, next we have the leaf. We can see kind of some bumpy textures. We can see some smooth textures in there. And then the last, this like stack of logs, okay? We would know that if we were to run our hand down that, it would feel rough, okay? So this is where our lecture is going to end today. We covered our first 5 elements. And then tomorrow we're going to start talking about our principles, right? We started with the elements and then we're going to be moving into principles. So make sure that you are taking notes, that you're again engaged tomorrow because you will be quizzed on this. But until tomorrow, bye everybody.